Please take their seats. I think we're ready to begin here. And before we do that, I want to just take 2 moments. One was to provide a little bit more information on the announcement I made earlier today. The distinguished David Orr, as I mentioned, is speaking on campus today. The title of his talk is Sustainability Leadership, and that's, again, at 2 o'clock in Orson Spencer Hall in the Hinckley Caucus Room if you're interested in attending that on campus later today. And secondly, before we move to the next panel, I just wanted to take a brief moment to recognize a few of my colleagues who are sort of have been in the background but really deserve the recognition. Of course, Jan Nystrom, the Associate Director of the Stegner Center, and Aaron Reardon. This conference would not be possible without their work, so please give them a hand. And also Professors Arnold Wrightsey and Jim Holkamp. Jim is on the stage right now. Provided really valuable input and help along the way, as did Professor Jim Obringer in the biology department at the university. The structure of this event, admittedly, and maybe I should admit this, but I'll do it anyway, was basically born from a Mexican lunch that Jim and I had. And it's probably the best thing that came out of that lunch, because other than that, it was just a few pounds that my wife said, hey, you're gaining a little bit of weight. Okay, so with that, please just give Arnold and Jim a hand as well. They're really valuable. One other logistical announcement before we begin. As you came in, there was the opportunity to get cards if you want to ask questions of the panel. You can fill these out in about an hour into the panel. We'll be collecting those, and then I'll bring those up to our moderator, and she'll be taking your questions in that format just to expedite the process and to be able to ask as many of the questions as we possibly can from the audience. So with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce this morning's last panel before our keynote by Professor Jody Freeman of Harvard Law School. This panel is focused on the West and specifically on Utah, and the title of the panel is Forging Solutions, the Wasatch Front as a Microcosm. Jennifer Napier-Pierce of the Salt Lake Tribune has been kind enough to agree to moderate this panel, and the roundtable discussion has several participants from the community and different segments of the community. Bryce Bird, who's the director of the Utah Division of Air Quality, Jim Holkamp, who's a partner at Holland & Hart and an adjunct law professor at the University of Utah, Kimberly Barnett, who is filling in for Mayor Ben McAdams. Kimberly is the Associate Deputy Mayor for Salt Lake County. Brian Mensch, who is the founder of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. Stephen Sands, who is the Director of External Affairs for Rio Tinto Kennecott Utah Copper. And finally, Kathy Van Dam, who's the coordinator for Wasatch Clean Air Coalition. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of these experts in this room. So I hope to learn a lot. I hope you do too. We're going to be talking about the health, the economic, the public policy issues surrounding this huge air pollution issue, with a particular focus today on solutions. So I'm thrilled to have this distinguished panel with me to brainstorm, and they can address all facets of this issue. Again, we'll get to your written questions later in the program. I want to start by building on an idea advocated this morning by Vicki Patton from the Environmental Defense Fund. She stressed pouring effort behind a Made in Utah plan within the Clean Power Plan and beyond that. I'm curious to hear from a few of you. What do you think a Utah blueprint could look like? And Jim, I'm going to start with you.
Excuse me. Well, as I think most of you know, and we've talked about it during this seminar, the Clean Power Plan, which is proposed by EPA, and as EPA is committed to finalizing it in a few months. And by the way, unlike most proposed federal rules, it's already subject to litigation, which that's a whole different issue. I see Professor Percival smiling. He and I had a conversation about that because the general rule is you don't challenge a rule until it's final. But at any rate, Utah already has a stakeholders group that has been convened to work on a Utah plan, even though the parameters of the final rule aren't quite set. This group consists of people from DEQ, from the State Energy Office, the power plant operators, Rocky Mountain Power, Intermountain Power, and Deseret Generation. I think Clean Utah is part of it. I have kind of dropped out of the discussions only because now they're getting really, really technical. They're using lots of numbers and formulas that I can't understand. But they are very focused on a Utah approach. One of the big challenges is that we have this big thing called California to the left of us, geographically. I didn't intend to be cute. It's to the whatever direction west is. I guess here it's that way. An example: the Intermountain Power Plant. Some of you are familiar with it. It's a big coal-fired power plant in Millard County, Utah, which within the next several years, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which most of the power generated by that plant goes to Southern California. California will not renew the contract because of California law that says no new long-term coal contracts, no electricity under long-term contracts from coal plants are to be imported into the state. Well, that's all well and good, and so this Utah stakeholders group is trying to figure out how do we deal with the repowering to natural gas and wind of Intermountain. How do we deal with the retirement of one of Rocky Mountain Power's big plants? But meanwhile, California is saying, because those electrons are mostly going to California, we want to take credit for the reduction in the clean power plan. And I only tell you that to illustrate that, number one, yes, Utah is trying to forge its own approach, but number two, there are some people that don't necessarily want Utah to have its own approach, including our neighbors 2 states over. That was a long answer. It may not have been to the question you asked.
No, interesting perspective. And Kathy, you've been an advocate in this arena for a very long time. I'm interested in your take on a Utah plan.
It's hard for me to know what to say because I'm not any good at bullet points. I just go way too long. Back in the 1990s, Bangor convened an air quality group. They studied for a long period of time. They came up with a number of recommendations, and those recommendations were instituted into the PM10 SIP, and that is what cleaned up our air, and that lasted us for decades. And as part of some of the air quality stuff that was going on for a couple of years ago, when Alan Matheson first came on board, I pulled that out and handed it to him and said, this is what we need to do again. And I advocated, and I would like to think that part of that pattern that was created in a Made in Utah stakeholder process that went on for years, that came up with really good recommendations that actually did work. And the governor is currently now working with his CAT, but it's that visioning thing where he's got one for water and one for emergency services and power and all of these things, and he's convened these stakeholder groups. And I think that there's a lot of really great stuff that's going to come out of that, and it's just beginning to crank up. But I think that we need the convening that the governor can do. We need all of the goodwill. We need the careful listening, harvesting other places for ideas, and understanding that all of the viewpoints are important. It isn't just my particular idea of what's important or your particular idea or your particular idea. What it is that we decide to do going forward is going to be the best that we can do right now, and as and we'll figure out better 10 years from now it'll be different, 20 years from now it'll be different. We will continue to need to figure out how to fit in this beautiful oasis. There will always be an oasis. I hope there will always be people here, and I hope that what it is that we do today leaves it better.
Who's more effective in improving air quality? The feds, the state, the counties? Dr. Mensch.
Well, one of the things that legislators frequently push back with against clean air advocacy groups is the idea that our air is actually improving over time, and that therefore the urgency or angst that a lot of us feel to do something about it really should be tempered by accepting the fact that the air is getting cleaner. Well, to a certain extent, there's some truth to that, but if you look at the real reason or the impetus for that, it's mainly the federal government and the Clean Air Act. And a study was just published 2 days ago in Southern California showing that, in fact, improvements in air quality in Southern California have now been demonstrated to translate into demonstrable improvements in lung function in children and adolescents. In fact, one of the researchers commented on this particular study and said that the amount of improvement in lung function between about 1995 and currently probably equates to lengthening a person's life expectancy by about 5 years. So it isn't just an issue of what is their exercise capability right now as teenagers. It affects their entire lifetime propensity for heart and lung disease and for their life expectancy. So in Southern California, things have improved as well, like they have improved somewhat in Utah. But that is a manifestation of the fact that it is the federal government that is really the prime mover behind that improvement. I'll go out on a limb here and reveal a little bit of my personal bias, but I shudder to think what the air quality would be like in Utah were it not for the federal government. So, we could spend a lot of time arguing which government agencies at the various levels have the most impact. But I would vociferously argue that the federal government has been the prime mover behind whatever air improvement we have experienced here in Utah, as it has been throughout the rest of the country.
Bryce, you want to defend the state?
Sure, but I need to do it in the proper context. So yes, I think that having the gorilla in the closet over the mountains there in Denver has helped us in crafting plans here in Utah. But I also think that stakeholder-driven plans in Utah have been effective and cost-effective as well. And I don't think that if we let EPA come in and do things directly, I think that they wouldn't have that same effect. I'll give you some examples. The Kennecott smelter. Steve can defend himself after me, I guess. Went through the process a number of years ago looking at sulfur dioxide, looking at PM10 problems here in the valley, and clearly the largest source was the Kennecott smelting operation. Because we had the ability to talk to people who lived here in Utah, the managers of the facility were here in Utah, they were able to convince their corporate partners or their corporate leadership that we really need to invest in better technology here in Utah if we're going to stay here in Utah, because there was some real discussions about whether or not it was viable to have a large smelting operation in a large urban center, because that isn't the case anywhere else in the world. They were able to invest the money both in first emissions reduction techniques, the double contact acid plant, and then in new smelter technology, which reduced emissions by literally tens of thousands of tons per year. Again, by having that stakeholder process where people were engaged, looking for solutions, looking for opportunities to both address the business need and the environmental need, we saw that great success. And so I guess my bottom line is that the Clean Air Act is written really well in that respect. It does create a level playing field in many cases across the country, but then puts the responsibility on the state to develop plans that are tailored to the state needs to the degree that they can. Of course, there is also flexibility that's frustrating, or lack of flexibility that's frustrating as well. But I think it does work well to put the solutions in place at the local level with the national standards in place to create that level playing field and protection across the country.
Steve, I will get to you in a minute, but I have to ask Kimberly about the county's role.
Pulling a plug for the county. Thank you. First, I want to just apologize on behalf of Mayor McAdams. This was a very last-minute change for him, and he really is so sorry he can't be here. But I think the question is, who's doing it better? The county is, no, I'm just kidding. It's a great question to ask, but really the better question is, what are our different roles in this solution, and what are our different authorities? And I think one of the advantages that the county has is we are in some cases able to make changes much quicker that have a real effect here in our county. Something the mayor says often that I appreciate is where county government is working that is not reflecting the world that we are living in now, we will change. And he has certainly lived up to that promise. So, for example, if it's our internal operations, Salt Lake County is one of the top 15 largest employers in the state. So whether we do things with our employees or the programs to our residents, such as a couple of new programs we have addressing lower income folks with high polluting vehicles, our recent wood burning regulation that was passed, or even facilitating change even on the legislative level. Salt Lake County, a few years ago, it did take us 2 legislative changes, but we were able to accomplish installing the largest solar rooftop installation on top of the Salt Palace. It was a lot of work. It took about 3 years, which I think in the timeline we're talking about sometimes is quick. And even if we're able to facilitate change with industry trends, such as installing an electric vehicle charging station at our government center and allowing our employees to use it for free, and then having a public station, do we have a line of cars waiting to charge at that station? Certainly not. But we did it to facilitate a change that we see happening in our county. So I don't know who's doing it best, but we're all working together and we're all able to do things a little bit differently. And again, one advantage I feel like the county has, and perhaps some other jurisdictions, is we may be able to implement things a little bit quicker.
The students in the Praxis Lab emphasized the crucial voice that industry has in the air quality discussion. And Steve, I guess what role do you see Rio Tinto and industry playing in solution finding?
Yeah, so incidentally, I signed the letter, so I think Chris Kaiser actually left our organization and they reached out to him, but was happy to sign on to that letter, and I'm also on the executive board of the Salt Lake Chamber, so I offered to the students that we could push that out through the Salt Lake Chamber's distribution list as well. But I think industry plays a pretty critical role in the air quality conversation, and certainly Rio Tinto is committed to working with the community on solutions to air quality problems. You know, I've been looking at air quality issues in Utah for about 20 years now. I think Bryce was a young inspector when we first started working together, and early in our careers, and I've seen a lot of evolution over time, but as industry, and they're in that heavily regulated category, major point sources like Kennecott, have added controls over time, and the standards continue to tighten. It gets more difficult, I guess, to still address these future problems and the current problems that we're having. And so at Kennecott, we've looked into things like auto reduction, some of our mobile fleet, conversion of 70 vehicles to compressed natural gas, you know, offering transit passes to our employees. It's those small changes that affect some of the mobile sources, LEED certification on buildings, you know, for some of the area sources that we have, in addition to the regulation on our point sources. And so, but we've not just done that within our fence either. We sort of have joined up with UCARE and other organizations that are focused on partnering. Utah Clean Cities does an annual idle conference, and we've shared our idling successes with over 100 companies, and about 20 large fleet owners have actually adopted a similar practice as what we have at Kennecott. So I think there's a certain amount you can do within your fence in industry, but I think there's a broader role industry can play in actually being involved in the community efforts to help solve air quality problems.
Thank you. I want to drill down on some of the issues that are being batted around on Utah's Capitol Hill as we speak, literally. Let's start with wood smoke. The governor's push to block burning wood all winter long prompted public outcry. As a result, it has stalled on the Hill. I don't think we can declare it dead on arrival, but it's struggling. What lessons have you learned from this exercise, Bryce?
Thanks. So just some quick history on the wood burning issue. Of course, we've been regulating wood burning for a long time. We've always realized that it is a major component of what we're finding on the filters that we analyze, and that has been the case for a number of years. And again, like all the other air quality issues, it has been improving over time as well. The Clean Air Action Team that Kathy mentioned, one of the recommendations that they made last year was actually 6 options for addressing wood burning here along the Wasatch Front. Many of those options have already been put into place to various degrees, change-out programs and education programs, looking at moving people all the way away from solid fuel burning to a natural gas appliance. And again, that was funded last year, and that's underway as well. But one of the options was just to ask the overall question, is it time to move away from an antiquated heating system, especially in our urban areas? Is it time to move away to something that is much cleaner, both for the environment and often less costly for the individual, and that is moving to natural gas appliances? As we went through that discussion, we thought it was time to bring the public into that discussion as well. So we thought that we'd provided the information. We had 2 wood burning workshops, and nobody came. What we found was that without the impetus of a mass media focus on something, that we weren't able to get the outreach and feedback that we needed. And so the decision was made to go ahead and propose a seasonal ban, but what was missed, unfortunately, in the media coverage was what we had asked was specific feedback on, should it apply to all areas? What else should we consider? Should it be different for different areas and different circumstances? But unfortunately, that was kind of lost in the messaging that ultimately went to the people of the burning community. So the lessons that I think that we can learn from this is first of all, to provide the right information, make sure that the message that's getting to the end of the row is the same message that was at the start of the row. This process was intended to, first of all, go out during the winter season so that people could have that connection to see how it impacts me. The Air Quality Board's actual proposal was a proposal to request information on different strategies and different areas. But again, unfortunately, what came about because of that was an overall ban was all that we would look at. And of course, we had 17 hours of public hearings. We had many comments that we received. Still, I'm generally an optimistic person. I think it was a success. I think that the discussion started. I know that a lot of people that came to the hearings got educated. Many people at the hearing said, I burn all the time now. I didn't even know there was restrictions in place. The only thing I saw was the TV coverage. I want to be able to burn. And it gave us the opportunity to educate them about the current issues, also educate them about best practices. That's something we've always promoted as well. So I think that the only bad outcome was the backlash, that we saw some legislation that would direct the Air Quality Board on how to solve this problem, and I think that we're still working to address those concerns at the legislature, and I'm still optimistic again that we can do that.
Dr. Mensch, how bad is wood smoke for the body?
Terrible. To elaborate a little bit on the issue of public involvement, if you were to ask the public in the state of Mississippi in 1965 whether or not they should adopt civil rights, that might have been defeated if we were doing that on the basis of public polls by maybe 7 or 8 to 1. If you were to ask whether or not we should ban assault rifles, if you look at national polling, probably 85% of the public is in favor of strict gun control, but we never get it because there's a very adamant advocacy group that is preventing that from happening. We're seeing the same sort of interplay here now with wood smoke. Nationally, about 10% of people burn wood for heat. I can't imagine the 90% of the people who don't are really that concerned about the supposed personal freedom to burn wood. And yet we have allowed, to this point in the process, a very vocal minority of the population to have a disproportionate influence on a public policy that has profound implications on public health. So how toxic is wood smoke? If you look at the toxicology literature, and which is where most of it is currently, and then the medical literature where there isn't quite as much, you get a very ominous picture of wood smoke. Comparing it, say, to secondhand cigarette smoke, wood smoke may be anywhere from 12 to 40 times more promoting of cancer or carcinogenic than secondhand cigarette smoke is. If you look at studies about the dispersion of wood smoke, out of California, for example, studies show that, in fact, if your neighbor is burning wood and you're downwind of that neighbor, you can personally, in your own house, experience levels of pollution 100 times greater than what is detected at the nearest monitor. So the practice of wood burning has profound implications on the community at large, but even greater implications on neighbors of wood burning. So if you look at it from the issue of why do we prohibit cigarette smoke in public venues, on airplanes? We don't do that because of what those practices do to PM 2.5 levels. We prohibit those practices because of what it does to people in the immediate area. And we need to start addressing wood smoke, not just its overall contribution to PM 2.5 in our air shit, but what does it do to people who are locally affected? And that's how we need to start looking at this issue. And the neighbor's right to a neighbor's right to breathe clean air, in our view, should supersede anyone's right to burn wood, especially when there are other alternatives. So wood's extremely toxic. It doesn't disperse well. There are better options. And the bottom line is actually the people who are most likely to benefit from a wood burning ban are the people burning wood themselves and their children.
Kimberly, in your comments, you mentioned that Salt Lake County has banned wood burning, and maybe you can talk about the approach through the health department.
Yeah, sure. This was a tough one, and the mayor knew when we decided to address this. This brings up a lot of emotion with folks. We even we started working on this in December, so you can imagine being seen as the ultimate Mayor Grinch during Christmas, taking away your fire during the holidays. But the mayor started, as we do with all of our initiatives, and that is with data. It is clear this is harmful, and addressing this issue will make a significant impact, and that is why he decided to move forward, of course, with the Board of Health. This was a Board of Health regulation. For those of you not familiar, what it did is ban solid fuel burning on those days that the state designates as a mandatory or voluntary day. It's important to note the first year of this is purely education, so no violations will be given this first year. And we're working with UCare, with Bryce and his office on educational materials for this. But, you know, despite those people that got our regulation mixed up with the state regulation, so thanks, you made us look like this was easy. We really didn't have a lot of backlash. We, of course, had to host public hearings on this. We got some attendance, and I got a few interesting emails and opposition. But this passed. Our county council was in full support, once again, because they understood the significant impact of solid fuel burning. And I think because of our approach, this is really a baby step. And I recognize some may see this as much more than a baby step, and I think the fact that we were willing to withhold violations for the first year just on education helped people get on board with this. But this is something we have to address. The mayor recognized this, and we were happy when it passed.
Kathy, during the public debate, there were some who argued that wood smoke is just a tiny little sliver of our overall air quality problem. Do you think that the state was right to take on wood smoke when it was only, 5% of the pollution mix?
We don't have any great big chunks of air pollution to get rid of, and 5% is not a little piece of air pollution. I think that especially unfortunate was the blowback that we got that has been dreadfully painful for many people. But I think it was very excellent for the regulators to hear what it is that so many of the people, the strong feelings that there were. Very few of the regulators are people who burn regularly and don't have any idea what the perspective of these folks are. And I think that they, too, are citizens, and they, too, have a right to their perspectives and consideration. We need to figure out together how it is that we're going to go forward, how it is that we're going to fit in this valley. And it's a really important thing to listen carefully to each other.
Bryce, before we leave Woodsmoke, blame the media? Really? Come on.
Sorry, I didn't intend to blame the media. I said we maybe weren't as effective at getting the message out.
Thank you for the clarity. Okay. I want to move on to a couple other bills that are working away on Capitol Hill. Representative Stephen Handy's bill would replace diesel school buses with a cleaner version, as I understand it. It is still being debated in the Senate on my last check. What kind of impact would a cleaner bus have on our air quality? Bryce?
So this is an interesting one. Actually, there are other bills as well looking at other heavy-duty diesel retrofits. Diesel trucks are very polluting. We hear a lot about, in the public education campaigns, about the importance of Tier 3 fuels and vehicles. We hear about anti-idling. We hear about avoiding cold starts. But of course, diesel trucks make up about 10% of the vehicle miles traveled in our valley, but about 30 to 40% of the emissions. They are very polluting. When you look at school buses themselves, they're down less than 1% of the total vehicle miles traveled. And then if you look at the dirtiest school buses, these 450 that this bill is looking to address, again, that's a fraction of a percent of the overall miles traveled. So yeah, as far as being a solution to overall air quality, Kathy talked about the 5%. Here we are focusing this legislation that seems very expensive, a $20 million price tag on what would be, in this first round, a fraction of a percent of the total emissions. Maybe doesn't sell very well. But I think the biggest impact for the diesel school buses is the fact that those that are being exposed most are those that are riding those buses. That especially in some of the larger counties in the state, some of those kids ride these buses for 3 hours a day. And if they're operating on an old technology school bus, it's them that's getting that biggest impact. So I think it is a good focus. Certainly, the fact that there are 450 of these buses still on the road, I think this legislation it would take multiple years at this funding level to address that, but it certainly is a public policy issue that is important, that the legislature needs to address, and the biggest impact is, again, on those kids that are riding the buses.
Brian mentioned the vulnerable population, kids, right? How does pollution affect the young developing body?
Well, with regard to the diesel bus issue, a number of studies show that, in fact, the concentrations of diesel exhaust inside the bus may be 4 to 8 times higher than outside the bus. So the school children are really victimized by these old school diesel buses. In the last 5 or 6 years, one of the areas of medical research that has really exploded is what air pollution does to the brain and to neurodevelopment in children. Diesel exhaust is particularly toxic to the developing brain. In fact, studies have been done where you take healthy human volunteers and put EEG probes on their brain, on their skull, to see what kind of stress levels are being triggered by exposure to air pollution. And within about 30 minutes, exposure to moderately high levels of diesel exhaust demonstrate by EEG monitoring an inflammatory process being kicked up in the brain that we know is associated with impaired learning. And so here you have a situation where we have our kids at their most important stage of learning and brain development, sending them to school, riding on a bus, maybe for an hour. Within a half an hour, they're likely to have been exposed to enough diesel exhaust that by the time they get to school, they're ability to learn has been impaired to the point where whatever happens the rest of that day is being compromised by the ride to school. Then you send them home on that bus, and then whatever what might have sunk in during that school day has been compromised again by the ride home. So that particular bill should not be looked at as what does that do to overall community air pollution levels, but what's it doing to the neurologic development, the intellectual capacity of our children, and it's doing a lot. So one of the things that we'd like to try and get more traction for is the idea that, yeah, we can argue at the state capitol level about hundreds of millions of dollars as to what we're going to do with education. But maybe the most important thing we can do in terms of allowing our kids a good education is having them breathe clean air so that their natural intellectual capacity is not compromised.
Steve, you mentioned in your earlier remarks about transitioning your fleet and your trucks and all the heavy equipment over to alternative fuels or cleaner burning. Can you expand on that just a little bit? Tell us more. How much did Rio Tinto spend on that, and what was the motivation?
So the motivation, I guess, was a lot of the commitment to air quality, and you know, it was an environmental initiative. We've been pretty committed to sustainable development, and you know, we got to looking at different technologies in the light fleet. Idle reduction was low-hanging fruit, but we didn't do it all at once. We're an organization of engineers, and so we started with a small pilot on a handful of vehicles, started to see some success and some results, and so we expanded the program to cover the entire light-duty fleet. Then we moved it onto the heavy-duty haulers with regards to idle reduction, and so it's sort of a start small, fail fast, fix, and then get implemented. And then similarly, then we were able to share that externally with other organizations so that they could benefit from our early learnings. The CNG fleet, we started that, again, with some work and relationship with Utah Clean Cities. We put a small number of vehicles under, bought a small number of CNG vehicles and purchased a single fueling station up on the north end of our operations. And then as we were replacing light-duty vehicles, we just replaced them with CNG vehicles as that fleet turned over, and then eventually got enough CNG vehicles in our operation to warrant a south end CNG fueling station. And so right now we're at about 70, and we just kind of continue to grow that. But we do recognize there's only so much you can do with regards to point source controls. If you've already got best available control technologies on the point sources, then where else can you make some improvements? And so the mobile fleet work with idle reduction and conversion to alternative fuels was an area. We also have a small electric charging station and a couple of electric vehicles. And so piloting that technology and learning from others, partnering with organizations on the mobile side, and then with regards to area sources, Daybreak is a sustainable walkable community, and so we've been leaders in energy efficiency in home designs and even our own buildings. As we build new buildings, we try to get them certified under the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, U.S. Green Business Council's LEED certification program. So we have more LEED certified buildings, I think, that are privately owned than anyone else in the state. So it is that combination of a commitment, awareness of our environmental impacts and commitment to the community that we have led out in a lot of those areas. And we're already regulated by Bryce and his group very heavily on the industrial side, but we recognize that there's more we can do in both the mobile source and area source. So that's what led to those programs.
That is something that we hear all the time, Bryce, is that regulation should focus on industry more. How do you respond to that?
Well, I agree. That has been our focus for a number of years, and in our latest plan to address the winter inversion particulate situation, a lot of the costly controls were again focused on industry as well. Right now, if you'll notice that as you drive by the refineries today, you'll see construction equipment cranes at each one of those refineries, and most of that construction is in response to these new requirements that we've placed on those facilities to install new controls. I think under the Clean Air Act, maybe that's one of the things that has been a focus, is that's what we have the ability to regulate really well. It's also been a criticism that we've heard as we look at public education and our discussion, that we maybe don't focus on that as much. And that was a conscious decision. As we focus on public campaigns, we need to use that limited time, that limited resource that we have to put information out about what people can do and focus on the fact that there are individual choices that in aggregate are actually more important or more impactful than the industry regulations because, again, the industry is becoming a smaller and smaller portion of our overall emissions. And as we look at the future, we see transportation continue to grow in vehicle miles traveled. We see, of course, the area sources, the small business, home heating, a lot of those choices that we make becoming a very much bigger portion of the pie. And again, I'll focus on that in two more examples, and that is in Utah County, of course, there aren't large industries, but in 2013, the concentrations in Utah County were about 60% higher than what we saw in Salt Lake County. And so it's clear to us that this focus on transportation, on individual choices, and on the area sources needs to be our focus in the future as we see, again, the limit of the ability to fix our problem solely on the point sources.
As we focus on solutions, I want to turn to Tier 3 fuel standards. And maybe, Jim, I don't know, is this an area of your expertise on how many other states are using the Tier 3? What kind of impact have they seen on their pollution? Is it coming to Utah anytime soon?
Well, first of all, as I tell law students, the most valuable thing you can get out of legal education is to learn how to make people think you know what you're talking about. So I'm about to do that. If you're really good, they'll write out a check afterwards. But Tier 3 fuel is called Tier 3 fuel because it's the next level. And Tier 3 vehicles are basically designed to reduce tailpipe emissions to increase gas mileage. Under the Federal Clean Air Act and some other federal statutes, the states have virtually no ability to regulate directly fuels or tailpipe emissions from cars. When Bryce talks about transportation strategies that the state can do, it's things like enhancing mass transit or various incentives or disincentives for behavior, but the state of Utah cannot affect in any way, shape, or form the implementation of the Tier 3 rules. Now, I do know that the governor has been in contact. Well, let me back up so you know what we're talking about. Under the Tier 3 regulations, beginning in model year 2017, U.S. automakers are required to begin or to produce cars that are so-called Tier 3 cars that will have much higher gas mileage and that will efficiently burn what is going to be called Tier 3 fuel, which is gasoline primarily, that has even lower levels of sulfur content than the current very low gasoline or sulfur gasoline, and that has to do with interactions in the catalytic converter. Because sulfur, as I understand it, sulfur over time in a car, the catalytic converter tends to interfere with that process, and so the older the car gets, the less efficient the converter is in taking out other pollutants. So what can Utah do about that? Well, not a whole lot. The governor is talking to refineries. One of the provisions in the Tier 3 fuel rule is that companies, refining companies that have more than one refinery in the United States can average compliance over their refinery fleet. And that's caused some concern in Utah because although, most people who see the refineries there in North Salt Lake think, geez, these are big. You ought to go to Baytown, Texas, or Pascagoula, Mississippi, where they're really, really big. These are small refineries. We're a small state still relatively, so these refineries generate about 80% of the fuel that are used inside the state of Utah. But I'm not speaking on behalf of the refineries, but I know that some of the companies that own these refineries are trying to figure out how they're going to comply, and there is a chance that one or more of these refineries may not be required individually to produce the Tier 3 fuel itself. So the governor, and so I'm getting to answer your question. I know that the governor and other state leaders are in conversations with the refineries to see if, even if under the Tier 3 rule itself, a particular refinery in Utah may not be required to comply, that they would do so as a matter of whether it's corporate citizenship or for some other reason. In my understanding, I have not been privy to those conversations, is that there is progress being made on that front. But the bottom line is that in 2017, every new vehicle sold, model year 2017 new car, will be a Tier 3 car by federal law. And the gasoline produced beginning 2017 will be so-called Tier 3 gasoline. I'll make one more point. I know that a couple of the refineries already are producing fuel that approaches the Tier 3 standard. And that has to do not because they're really good guys, which they are, but because of the nature of the crude oil that they process. We don't have particularly high sulfur crude that comes into this particular part of the country. So if you don't have a lot of sulfur to begin with, it makes it easier, to squeeze it out.
Bryce?
Just to add, I think that there's going to be a lot more public discussion about Tier 3, even though as Jim mentioned, the federal fleet standards go into effect in 2017. There's still choices in education that need to be made on the individual basis. The car manufacturers can meet that standard by having the average of their fleet meet that standard. And how they're doing that is making very efficient small cars, but less efficient trucks, minivans, sport utility vehicles. And so as we make choices here in Utah, we need to be aware of that because of our current vehicle mix, we know that we're going to have more of those larger vehicles, more of those vehicles that, as you average out the fleet, won't see the impact. And that's one of the difficulties that we have as modeling the impacts of Tier 3 when it comes out, is the fact that there's still a personal choice and education component of that. That as we buy a car today, we could actually buy a Tier 3 equivalent car today, and there's actually a window sticker component of that new car vehicle sticker. That's the smog rating that's down in the bottom right-hand corner. If it's an 8, 9, or 10 on that smog rating, that's a Tier 3 car that we could buy today. And part of it is that education that
So you don't have to wait for the fuel? You don't have to wait for Tier 3 fuel?
You don't. Again, those vehicles are being produced today. They are more efficient with the cleaner fuel, but the vehicles themselves are available today. And again, that's that choice piece and that education piece that needs to continue.
Before we leave this topic, Dr. Minch?
Well, lost in the discussion about refineries and Tier 3 gasoline is the fact that I'm sitting next to a state agency that permitted expansion of the refineries in the last couple of years. The refineries themselves and Kennecott, we're suing to stop the refineries expansion, and we're suing to stop Kennecott expansion. So I'm in a little bit of an odd situation here.
We still.
But I'm trying to be good friends with them while we're suing them. But one of the reasons what we are suing them is because these refinery expansions, while they will decrease the amount of pollution at the refinery level per unit of product refined, they are going to increase the overall pollution from the refineries. And then when you add to that the increased diesel exhaust from all these new hundreds of diesel trucks bringing this new substrate in from the Uinta Basin, the refinery expansion is a big issue in terms of our overall pollution. So with regard to the refinery issue itself, it's pretty simple. The refineries want to make more money, and by doing that, they can get crude substrate from the Uinta Basin, black wax crude, at a discount, refine it here in Salt Lake, and they're going to ship the excess product to Southern California and Las Vegas. So it's a pretty simple triangle. Oil companies in Texas get the profits, Southern California and Las Vegas get the gasoline, and Utah gets the pollution. We don't think that's a very favorable equation for residents along the Wasatch Front. So that needs to be part of the discussion about refineries and Tier 3 gasoline, is what else is going on with our refineries that will affect people. And the other thing I want to mention is that when it's often talked about that the industry is only responsible for something like 11% of our pollution, There's a lot of ways you can look at statistics and say just about whatever you want to say. One of the things that's unequivocal is the fact that if you live in Bountiful, the refineries are not 11% of the pollution in Bountiful. They are a significantly greater percentage of the overall problem. And then you look at the medical literature that says industrial pollution is more toxic to genes, to chromosomes, than, say, tailpipe pollution. You get a whole different picture of this whole problem. And one of the things that we'd like to get more traction on is the idea that not all air pollution is created equal. Probably the worst is wood smoke, and right behind that is industrial emissions. And if we're going to protect public health, we ought to focus on the types of pollution that are the most responsible for public health impacts.
I'm sure that'll all be settled in court. Jim, something to add?
I don't want
Very
to
quickly, though.
belabor the point, except to suggest that, believe it or not, the refineries here in Utah do provide some positive benefits to the state. These are difficult issues. Not all of the dollars go to Texas. There are a lot of jobs, there are a lot of tax revenues. The gasoline that you and I buy, as I said, about 80% of it in this state come from those refineries. Without those refineries, we would be paying a heck of a lot more for gasoline. So I just, I'm not going to get in, I don't think this is the forum for Dr. Munch and I to get into a debate about the relative merits of the permit challenges of the refineries. But I would make the kind of the overall point, though. I recall I went to lunch with Professor Reitze and Judy Fays, who now is a reporter for KUER. And Judy asked Professor Reitze, well, what is a single most important thing that we can do in the state of Utah to reduce air pollution? And he had a very profound response. Quit burning. Whether it's fuel, whether it's wood. I mean, the reality is that when we combust things, we get pollution. Now, Dr. Munch is exactly right. I mean, when you start looking at areas where you are in relation to sources, the particular sources and all those kind of things, they have different health effects. But we make individual choices. When I got in the car this morning and come here, I was burning gas. I have a Prius, but frankly, most of the time it burns gas, so it's good mileage. But that's just the reality, and that's what makes a lot of these issues so difficult. If they were easy, we'd have a seminar on something else.
We've talked Tier 3, we've talked about diesel, buses, replacing fleets. Before we leave vehicles, and there's more ground to cover, Kimberly, can you just quickly talk about the grant that Salt Lake County received? Because not everybody can afford a 2017 brand new car and do their civic duty.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was so excited about this program. We wrote a grant with UCare, and we're lucky enough to be awarded that grant. As you may know, Salt Lake County has run the I&M program for decades, and we've saved over 1 million tons of pollution through that program. But what we realized is there was a part of the population, specifically low-income individuals, who tend to have high-polluting cars. They're older cars. They usually don't have the kind of income to get them fixed properly. And what was happening is they were coming in for their inspection, and as you may know, you can get a waiver on that inspection, not on your safety, but you can get a waiver on the inspection, and our folks hope that you go get that fixed in time for next year's inspection. So we saw this hole in servicing these folks. So with this grant, we were able to start a program called the Vehicle Repair Assistance Program. It is run through our Environmental Health Department, who does the I&M program. So people can apply for this program. There's a very simple application, and if you qualify, this is a pilot right now, so we were able to utilize our existing fleet and the highly qualified folks that we have at our fleet. So if they qualify, we will take their car to our fleet facility, determine what the problem is, find out how much it will cost, see if that will if that's reasonable, given the life cycle of that particular car, we will fix it for them at no charge.
How many people are taking you up on the offer?
Oh man, when this was announced, we only have I think about, I want to say 40,000 right now in this pilot. The amount of calls that we received when this was announced in the media, it was clear, as I mentioned before, this is a hole in service that is not, we're not addressing this with these folks who can't afford to buy a new car, and having that form of transportation is absolutely critical for them. So I won't be surprised if that funding is gone by the middle of the year, but we're committed to this program now. And our hope is the mayor can allocate additional funds for next year and we can grow that program because it is absolutely needed. And the people we are helping, these are just wonderful stories to hear. And they want to be a part of the solution. I was able to meet a woman who benefited from this program. And I mean, she said just clearly, I don't want to pollute. I didn't even know my car was polluting that badly, and I want to be a part of that air quality solution, and this program allowed her to do that. Many of the folks that apply for this, they have gotten other repairs, usually by not very qualified technicians, so they have spent money to try and fix this problem and are pleased that we can utilize our fleet and get this done for them.
So many of the solutions we've talked about so far do rely on money, and it does rely on data. I believe that Governor Herbert recommended about $2 million in research to go directly toward air quality research. Kathy, if you held the purse strings, where do you think the research dollars should go? Where do you get the most bang for your buck?
I'm not qualified. I think that the last tranche, we had $1 million last year, and DAQ went through and made decisions based on the unknowns that they are facing. And I expect that the next time they'll do the same thing and figure out what it is that they need to know. The airshed is very complicated. Probably there will be a lot of work done on wood smoke. What are the actual impacts? How much does it really, what are the actual impacts? How much wood burning there is? What are the things that keep people burning wood? But that's just a guess. The folks that are involved in developing this stuff, I mean, they got a whole team, and they're good guys. We're very, very fortunate in our DAQ and the staff.
Dr. Mensch, I suspect you would like to see a chunk of that go toward medical research, health effects of air pollution exposure, and there's a lot of that going on right now. I keep seeing studies out of BYU and Utah about water vapor or the effects on cardiovascular health, or it just keeps going on, fertility, mortality, infant mortality. Where would you like to see it go?
Well, I'm going to back up the question just a little bit. Every single medical study that you read ends with a sentence, more study is needed. Every single one. In the last 15 years, we've probably had about 3,000 major medical studies published about the broad health impacts of air pollution. It's not like we don't have enough information. We have a ton of information. So while all scientists want more research to be done on virtually every issue you can think of, and we do on the health impacts of air pollution, we certainly want more research. What we don't want to see from the standpoint of public policy is continual delay in public policy implementation under the guise that we don't have enough information and enough research hasn't been done. So that's the first thing I want to emphasize. With regard to some specific things, there is some value from the standpoint of politics in doing Utah-based research. Unfortunately, and there's no reason for this, the state legislators often want to know what research has been done in Utah as if the research done in other parts of the world doesn't really count because Utah's special. And we all know Utah's special. I think Utah's special. I was born here. I've lived most of my life here. It's very special. But it's not so special that we can't learn from what research has been done elsewhere. But given the fact that the legislature likes local Utah-based research, let's do it. But let's not use it as an excuse to delay public policy implementation. I'll just give you one example of a study that some friends of mine pitched to the DAQ, and I'll elbow Bryce here from about 5 feet away. One of the researchers that I am friends with at LDS Hospital just recently published data on the association between telomere length, and telomeres are the repeating sequences of DNA on the ends of chromosomes. They serve the same function as your shoelace caps in that they keep the chromosomes from unraveling. They just recently published research showing that you can very precisely measure a person's life expectancy by looking at the length of a person's telomeres, unless you get killed, obviously, by trauma. I tried to help him pitch a study to the DAQ to let's start studying the telomere length of Utah residents, people who live along the Wasatch Front. Let's see what our air pollution is doing to our chromosomes and our life expectancy based on the length of our telomeres. We didn't get funded. Bryce, I hope we do next time.
Bryce, do you want to comment on how you prioritize?
Yes, first, clear up that we wish it was $2 million also. It was $750,000, which is still
I thought it was 1.8. Sorry.
a big amount. The other portion of that was actually clean air programs. So actually going in there and competitively providing money to do retrofits and things like that. So also very important. But I think the real value of Utah-based research is really understanding some really unique situations. Our inversions, the chemistry that happens during the inversions to trap and enhance air pollution is unique to us. And it's not understood well. One of the things that we need to do is have chemical models that are able to reproduce that. We are relatively good, but we're not completely convinced that we have all the answers yet. And so last year's funding was focused on improving the modeling, improving the chemistry model especially, so we could replicate what we're seeing on the filters with what the model is predicting. Also, I think that the other real value of Utah research is understanding what the best controls are, or retrofits and things like that can be put in place. I mentioned earlier, cold starts. One of the studies that we funded this year was understanding how cold starts, or the first few minutes you operate a vehicle while its emissions controls aren't functioning yet. How much of a difference does that make? Is that really where we need to focus? And this leads to our overall discussion about transportation emissions. If you are relying on public transportation to solve the air pollution problem, but everyone's driving that first 2 miles to the transit stop, well, most of the emissions for that trip have already happened during that cold start. And so is that the best public policy? Or is it maybe we should focus, rather than having the large transportation parking lots, focus on the circulating transportation that lets people get that first and last mile, that then eliminates the need for that cold start. So I think it is looking for tailored information here in Utah. The other example, of course, has already been mentioned in the earlier panels, and that is research in the Uinta Basin. Understanding which pollutants to control, understanding which technologies to implement, and building on the 5 years of study by a number of researchers to understand the unique situation there of winter ozone, which really is something that is not well addressed in the literature.
I think we're getting close to your time. I sense that people are buzzing out there. So in a minute, we'll get to your questions. I want to follow up on something that you said, Steve, just the outlay that Rio Tinto has put into improving its fleet, et cetera. Since money talks, would tax incentives or tax credits, would they help encourage industry to clean up their act, to invest in cleaner technologies? And I'm just asking your assessment of a public policy.
I mean, I suppose they could. Incentives could help.
Would it persuade you?
So one of the challenges, I think, is having technology that's available. Once you've already got the best technology that's commercially available, there's really nothing else you could go out and buy. And so you've got to look at other areas, and there may be incentives certainly could motivate a lot of the work that Bryce mentioned, this clean air retrofit technology program with other mobile sources and stuff. There may be lower hanging fruit that's available, and incentives maybe would be better directed towards those things that could get the biggest bang for that incentive buck. And so I think that people continue to look at that. I think though we've done some things on a voluntary basis with combined heat and power units and other installations that we've done, and we have, if there's been incentives for some of those energy initiatives, we have pursued those, and they certainly can help, the business case for getting projects across the line. If you can find a project that helps reduce your emissions and help improve your business performance and help, something that could be shareable externally, those are win-win-wins. And so sometimes incentives can help tip the scales on investment decisions. But again, as we think from a policy perspective, where would the state be best placed in putting their incentive monies? And it may be directed at things other than industrial sources. It may be at some of these diesel retrofit type opportunities.
Before we get to the questions, I want each of you mentioned low-hanging fruit. So give me one thing that you think should be done right away. There should not be a delay on this to clean up the air. Kimberly, I'm going to start with you and just kind of work down the line.
One thing, just one
thing.
Okay, well, I'm just going to focus. I've mentioned already the county is a very large employer and our internal operations are significant. So we build a lot of buildings. And I think so, okay, I'm just going to go to one thing. I'm just going to focus on one thing, and that's our internal operations, fleet, facilities, our procurement practices. Who do we do business with? What do we require them? Do we require them to be a sustainable business, to do business with them? What are we doing with our employees? What are we requiring of them sustainability-wise to be a part of the solution? So if there's one thing I can say, Salt Lake County, there's so many things, but one thing is we got a lot to do internally. We're doing a lot, but we can do a lot more to tighten things up.
Kathy?
Boy, I wish I'd prepared for this. My guess, probably the easiest, quickest thing that we could do is to finalize the ultra-low NOx water heaters. One of the recommendations that came out of the CAT was that, as everybody here should know if they don't already, our area source is the growing part of our emissions pie. As our population grows up and we have more homes and we have more stores and we have more of these area sources that they're called, that segment of the emissions pie is growing, not only as a percentage of the pie, but also as an absolute segment. So looking to what can be done for that section, and one of the strategies that I've heard of recently is this ultra-low NOx water heater, and when they're available on the market, they can be the same price as a regular water heater. It really is just I hope, if we're not mistaken now, because we've had that is something that could be done and would make a difference. And those water heaters, as they're heating water, would be then making less NOx, which is one of our problem pollutants.
Steve?
So I may take a little different angle on this one and say education. The legislature authorized some public messaging funding last year, and if you think about the size of the pie, there is a significant portion that comes from automobiles and individual driving habits and cold starts and all the things Bryce talked about. Kathy was just talking about area sources and what can people do in their homes or small businesses. And I think the more we can get people educated, I was driving the other day, slippery snow, and if you can get your tires aligned around what you can be doing and you can get your community engaged, your tires engaged, you can keep from slipping off the road. And so I think education does have a role to play in helping to get further traction on things that we can do as a community to help solve air quality problems, because as the standards get tighter, it gets harder and harder to identify any one silver bullet. But if we can educate people in the things that businesses can do, things that individuals can do, things that industry can do, I think we can progress towards solving the issues.
Thank you. Dr. Mensch?
Well, if I had to pick one thing, I think it would be to ban wood-burning cars. That's a much bigger problem than you know. If you really dig into the medical research and try and examine what are the components of air pollution that have the most impact on public health, I know some people don't want me to say this, but actually, from that approach, wood burning again rises to the top. Now, not far behind, as I mentioned before, are other issues, but if I had to pick one thing to do, it would be to try and eliminate wood burning as much as possible, if not totally, in the urbanized areas of the Wasatch Front. I think from that, we would have the greatest single benefit to public health overall.
Okay, very good. Jim?
Healthy Utah. What? Medicaid expansion? And I'm serious. I have, there is a connection, and let me explain it. And I've learned this, I've worked the last several years with lower-income communities in this valley and elsewhere, and I have come to discover that there, at least in this country, I believe is a direct correlation between environmental health and income. And these are folks who drive the oldest, dirtiest cars, who live in the least efficient apartments, who pay the most for heat and electricity, and who desperately want to mitigate their own environmental footprint. And when they have, when they get sick, their choice is, do I go to the doctor or do I pay rent so I don't go to the doctor? And it ends up pretty soon they're in the emergency room and we all pay for that. But I think it's not as measurable as we might like, but I think focusing on poverty mitigation and enhancing the status of these folks through a program like Healthy Utah, which, don't get me going on that, in the next week could be fixed.
Bryce, last word.
So yes to everything you've heard so far, but I think everyone that's been here in this conference has a level of education that is so much, so far ahead of what the general public has on this issue. Over the past 2 days, you've heard about the Clean Air Act, you've heard about the health studies, you've heard about the connections, you've heard about the fact that air pollution is half as important as the entire medical profession and healthcare system in the United States at impacting public health. What I learned through this legislative session, and maybe that lesson learned from the optimistic side of looking at the wood burning issue, is what impact 1 or 2 phone calls from a constituent has on a legislator. The typical House district is about 30,000 people. Only about 12,000, 8 to 12,000 actually participate in the elections and vote those people in. And when they're making decisions on an issue, 1 or 2 phone calls can change their opinion on what they understand they're representing of those 30,000 people in their district. And so I think that my one thing would be that everyone in each of those districts and each of the communities in Utah could have the experience that you've had over the past few days to understand the issues, the connections, understand that it's not just self-serving to fund Division of Air Quality and air quality programs, but it does take funding. My agency represents about 0.1% of the state's budget. That's not very much, but think of what we could do if we could incentivize some of these things that we've talked about, that the public could understand the benefit that would come from increasing taxes or finding revenue sources to help people change out to cleaner technologies or cleaner vehicles. Steve mentioned the best available control technology program. Well, under the Clean Air Act, that applies only to companies that are expanding. We know that there are companies here in Utah that are still operating on 1960s technology that have never expanded their production or changed their production, so they've never cleaned up or had to clean up their facilities by installing the best available control technology. If we could incentivize those, if we could find, again, those funding streams to identify those and bring them up to current technology, that could also go a long way. So I think it is an overall education, but then driving that to making that focus at the legislature and ultimately communally funding these projects and programs that improve air quality that are tied to health improvements.
Thank you. A diversity of opinions. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to spin through these really fast. If you can keep your answers brief so we can get through as many as possible. This one is directed to you, Kimberly. If the county can make meaningful changes, as you said, why don't you have an anti-idling ordinance?
Oh, I was going to say, we do have an anti-idling
Okay.
policy. Darn it. Great question. Yeah, why don't we have an anti-idling ordinance? And that's something we've talked about, that's been explored. And to be clear, there's a couple ways we could approach it. Salt Lake County, and I'll keep this brief, we have jurisdiction. We are the local government for the unincorporated county. So the Salt Lake County Council could go that route for the unincorporated county, not necessarily for the 16 incorporated cities within Salt Lake County. But there has been discussion on that. Discussion will continue. It's something the mayor is interested in. And we would certainly need the support of the county council, and talk about people attending a public hearing. That would bring people out, but that's an important item that we could tackle, but it has been talked about.
A question maybe for Bryce, I don't know. Why just wood burning? Why not combine with other sources? For example, drive-through coffee, laundry, leaf blowers, lawn mowers, snow blowers, ATVs. It goes on and on.
So I agree completely, and that's part of that lack of our ability to communicate well. People thought we were just going after the wood burning. The Air Quality Board in the past 2 years has finalized 31 rules that impact emissions reductions from various source categories, all the way down to water heating, pilot lights on gas appliances, things like that. So I think the messaging is we have gone after all the other categories as well. This is one that made the media, but certainly the Clean Air Retrofit Program, our ability to go in there and incentivize these activities based on the best emissions reductions are another example, but certainly this is not the only focus of air pollution regulation in Utah.
Okay. I don't know who wants to take this one. If tourism declines as a result of dirty air with a resulting decrease in state revenue, do you think that this would be enough to motivate the state legislature to impose more stringent air quality standards? Money talks. Who wants to take that one? A decrease in tourism, Dr. Mensch?
I don't have the statistics at my fingertips about how much money tourism brings to the state of Utah, but my gross understanding is it brings to the state of Utah much more than the extraction industries do. Obviously, in addition to protecting tourism, we'd like to see science be the driving force behind whether or not Utah is going to be a participant, if not a leader, in the fossil fuel feeding frenzy that is obviously disrupting the climate. We look at the snowpack in our mountains and think that if this is typical for our future, civilization along the Wasatch Front will be very difficult to maintain. And so if we continue with the disconnect between our participation as a state in heavily focusing on fossil fuel extraction in eastern Utah and the Uinta Basin, we're basically undermining our own future. It's far beyond tourism. It's whether or not we're going to actually be able to live here in 50 years. That should really be our emphasis. I'm all for tourism. I love tourists. I'd like to be one someday. But I'd also like to have a place for my kids and grandkids to live, and I'm afraid we're putting that in jeopardy.
Jim, did you have something to add about the influence that
Well,
tourism dollars have on the
have
legislature?
any hard information on tourism dollars and all of that stuff. There is no question. I get really annoyed when on a winter day, Saturday, I go outside, take a deep breath, it burns, and the only way that my wife and I can get warm and see the sky is to go to Park City. Yes, I participate in that. I don't have anything more to add. It's in terms of the connection between tourism dollars lost in the legislature, I don't think anybody's quantifying that. There's a lot of talk about that in terms of policymakers. And I don't have the dollars, but the extractive industries have brought some benefit to the state, but we won't go there because we'll start arguing and you'll still be here.
But that would be more fun. Okay. We'll go on. Vehicle repair assistance. What is the average cost to repair a vehicle that does not comply with emissions regulations? I don't know. Kimberly, do you have a sense?
Yeah, I want to say the numbers 500 to 2,000 were coming to my brain on, and we just started this program, so we've only completed about 10 to 15 repairs so far. But we could go higher. So that's the number that's popping in my head. But we could go higher. Really just depends on the life of the vehicle and if we feel like the repair would be worth that amount. But yeah, darn it, that's the number that's sticking in my head. I hope it's
Which
right.
air emissions controls are cost effective? Who wants to tackle that one? No one?
That's
Jim?
there. It depends. A classic legal answer. I mean, if you're talking about a large industry, it depends. You've got things to take out sulfur. You've got things to knock down nitrogen oxides in cars. It's catalytic converters. This illustrates the complexity of the issue because there's no one size fits all when you're talking about reducing emissions. You got to look at the source of the emission, then you got to figure out, how you're gonna control it. I mean, there's no. I wish there were. But there's no easy answer to that. It's very, very case specific.
This one. Crude oil from the Uinta Basin is delivered to the refineries by an endless stream of tanker trucks. This has caused pollution from these trucks as well as being a traffic hazard. What is the best way to deliver this crude oil as all options have potential problems? Pipeline, rail, truck.
All options have potential problems, yes.
Right.
Okay.
Microwave.
I'll throw out one, stop delivering it. No, I mean, I don't say that flippantly. It goes back to the issue of whether or not Utah is going to have an economy based on fossil fuel extraction or not. And if we're not going to have that kind of an economy, then we have to be willing to say, well, there's going to have to be some constraint on what's going on in the Uinta Basin.
Kathy, you're nodding too. You want to add something?
I'm going to say in public something that I should not, so be all prepared. I think that the Uinta Basin oil should go out to Green River. I think we should have refineries there in Green River. I think we should move the refineries off the Wasatch Front. It will never happen, but that's my solution. I think that Brian is right that we need to get off of fossil fuels, and I think that any time that you have a big swing, you've got tremendous dislocations and injustice, and if we can kind of keep the pressure going, and from my perspective, if we can give us a pressure relief valve to the Uinta Basin and slowly crank down on the refineries here in the Wasatch Front, and make it all the time be getting smaller and smaller, because we really do need to get off of fossil fuels. That is necessary.
Anyone else? I guess our time is up, so I'll end with this final one. What are the solutions a regular citizen can consider to improve air quality best? Anyone? Dr. Mitch?
Vote differently.
Okay. Any other thoughts from our panel? Bryce?
Just if somebody needs some suggestions, there are a couple of good resources. One is ucare.org, so ucair.org. They've got tips and suggestions from every category with that understanding that everything we do impacts air pollution, from products that we buy on the shelf to how we clean our ovens to how we fix our hair. All these things have an air quality connection, and there are choices that can be made that, as we make those daily choices, can make a little difference. And everyone making a small difference, when you get 1 million people doing it, certainly makes a big difference.
And one of those choices has already been made for me because I can't fix my hair. But just follow up, individual choices. Everything you do individually has an impact. It's not always somebody else's fault. It may be But you make the decision on the car you drive, on the products you buy, on where you live, all of those things. It's individual choice.
I suppose we will leave it there. Thank you to our brain trust up here. It's been great.